very warm welcome to the Understanding Users podcast, brought to you by Researchable UX. It's great to have you with me. I'm your host, Mike Green. I'm a freelance user research lead and digital consultant based in the UK. Over the coming weeks, I'm going to be chatting to various digital experts who I've had the pleasure of working with in recent years. They're from various disciplines, including user research, UX design, development, and product management. And they'll even be a digital business owner or two. I'll be talking to them about how they came to be in their current roles, what they've learned along the way, and what advice they may have for others getting into the field. These are intended to be relaxed, informal chats with professionals who are keen to share their experiences. So sit back and enjoy.
In this episode of Understanding Users, I speak with 4 freelance digital experts who are friends of mine and who I had the great privilege of working with a few years back. We reflect on a particular large-scale UK government transformation project that we all worked on, what we did, how and why we did it, the challenges we faced, and what we learnt along the way. To what extent is an organisation ready to hear and then act upon problematic and challenging feedback from users of its services? How do you change long-established and deep-rooted processes within an organisation? Why are collaborative design workshops so powerful to the UX process? What can happen if you don't fully bring senior stakeholders with you on the journey? And why is the UK government's GDS assessment process so important in guiding teams to build digital services the right way? My wonderful, highly experienced guests are Laura Cusack, John Sykes, Ben Watson, and Louisa Harper. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoy the episode.
Could I just get you to go round, I don't know who the first volunteer is, but just introduce yourself and your role.
Okay, so my name's Louisa and I was the content designer on the project. I'll go for Ben.
Hey, I'm Ben Watson. I'm a user experience practitioner. On the project, I was an interaction designer. John.
Right. I'm John Sykes. I am currently UX delivery lead with the Financial Conduct Authority, which is a lot of fun, by the way. Really, really great organisation. I could talk long about that on another episode for you. But on this particular project, I was working as a service designer. I guess it's over to you, Laura.
Yeah, and I'm Laura Cusack, and I was the delivery manager on the project.
Fantastic. Thanks, everyone. So we're going to cast our minds back about 4, or is it 5 years? It feels like a long, long time ago. We can't go into too much detail about certain things for obvious reasons about commercial sensitivities and so on. But in terms of the client, it was a large UK government ministry. Can I say that? I think I can. Let's begin with the key problem we were trying to solve. Kind of what was the problem space?
I guess you could say it was a service that could impact anyone potentially. So it was quite wide ranging, and it was something that could affect any citizen potentially. Indeed. But it also affected individuals as well as businesses, and that's why it was so complicated.
And I'd like to think as well, we were also trying to help those who are at a very vulnerable point and having to deal with very difficult circumstances, and they really needed help.
And it was what was interesting about that particular thing, Louise, is the situation that people were in when they came to this service, because often in conflict with another person who we're also looking after as well. So you've got 2 vulnerable people potentially in conflict, and we were trying to help resolve that conflict as amicably and as straightforwardly and legally as possible. While at the same time, you've also got lots of stakeholders, lobbyist groups who are representing many of the different interests, which I thought was probably one of the more complex sides of the project, in the sense that we had. It's really hard describing this without saying anything, isn't it?
Keep going.
No pressure at all. We had lobbyist groups from all angles. We had stakeholders from within the organisation, and everyone was very politicised in this particular project. So trying to balance all of that while at the same time really trying to concentrate on the needs and challenges of the people we're trying to represent was an overwhelming challenge. And I thought what I love about this project and why I love you all so much is I think you guys did an amazing job of actually delivering. So, and I guess that's why you brought us together today.
And I was going to come on to what challenges we face, and you've started to touch on that. How did we go about kind of overcoming those challenges?
I think for me, I was thinking about this last night. I think the standout moment for me personally was actually when John did the workshop where you brought all the sort of competing sides together and got them to sit down with each other and talk to each other, which I didn't feel had ever happened before, or not in the same way. It was an open conversation, and you allowed everybody to kind of give their view and conclude that actually they're probably not as opposed as they thought they might have been, which was the conclusion of that workshop. I thought it was great.
And it's interesting because we've done that many times with many different organisations, with a lot of you on the call as well, where we've had different what looked like opposing opinions and perspectives, and then they come and sit around a table and realise actually it's not as difficult as we thought. There's more similarities than there are differences, and there are overlaps where we can come to an agreement. So yeah, I think collaborative design workshops, which is what we're talking about there, are a super important part of the design process. It allows everyone to get around the table, look at the challenges from their own perspectives, and also understand the perspective of others and find that common ground, which makes for a great solution. Now, I don't think everyone is always going to be super happy, but you get to a point where everyone's needs are met, usually. So I think that's one of the things that came out of that piece.
I also think it was useful for the people from the government department to see that happening.
They were very scared, weren't they? They were very scared about the idea of getting everybody in the room at the same time. And you know what? I've done that workshop so many times, and always the same pattern, in the sense you've got the policy people who are kind of, and the government representatives, always very scared about the idea of bringing people together into the same room. Largely because I've never seen a workshop like this before, because usually when they talk about a workshop, what they're talking about is a meeting. And this is not a meeting in the normal sense. Everyone's got an activity to do. People are working in small groups, which is very different to what a workshop might mean in some of the government meetings that you've been to or workshops you've been to before.
Ben, I think you were going to come in.
Yeah, I think John's largely, I think, covered. But what I was going to say is just seeing people with sort of naturally, obviously, without, it's a bit sort of abstract without knowing what the product or what the project was about, but people that had basically opposing interests, because in any given sort of use case, only in this sort of dialogue that was being facilitated, only one party would likely come out sort of satisfied, and another party would inherently be disappointed. However, I think in principle, what we saw in those design workshops were, regardless of where you where sort of these parties sort of interests lie, they sort of agreed in principle that there was potentially a sort of a single, a design, not solution, but proposal that ticked the box for everyone. So despite the various interests, there were some sort of common, and it didn't feel like compromise either. But basically, some commonality in terms of what a system could facilitate.
And going back to those workshops, you've talked, both of you, at length about that. I mean, let's just drill down into the kind of format of them. So how did we organise them? We talked about bringing different people together, but what was the format? What made them so kind of successful? And
great. So I've got to now remember back 4 years to a workshop. I'm guessing they probably followed a similar format, a similar pattern, in the sense that one of the key parts is bringing the different players together so that they can share their experiences, look at the different challenges that we've identified during our discovery process, and come together and try to work through potential solutions. And the way we do that is we start off by having the people in the workshop start to empathize a little bit with the users. So we have the different users that are at play, and we get them to have a think. And we usually have a process called an empathy map, where we get them to think about the different aspects of the journey that someone might go through and how they might be thinking or feeling during that process. And just try to get everyone a little bit more on the side of the person they're designing for. And usually we break them into groups. So on this particular example, we had 2 key users that we're trying to satisfy. And we mixed people up. So they might be having to empathize with somebody that they normally saw as an opponent. So that was kind of one of the key movements here, really, is getting people to start thinking about the service from somebody else's perspective. And I think that made a big difference. And then we introduced the challenges that we identified during the discovery process. And fundamentally, we asked people to brainstorm solutions and then give some indication of which solutions they think are the most likely to deliver a good outcome. And then we ask them to storyboard them so we can sort of see how they might work in the real world. So often you find that ideas that you have in a workshop can be at a conceptual level, don't necessarily land very well when you try to work out how that would really play out. So by storyboarding, it allows people to, what I call earth it, allows people to take that concept that sits in their head and see how it would play out in the real world. So that's fundamentally the principle of the workshop. And from the back of that, we don't end up with probably just 1 or 2 ideas. What we found is that there's lots of ideas that are generated throughout the whole of the day, and we can sort of cherry pick those and work through. And a bit like weaving a carpet, almost, you kind of take a few ideas and you weave them together until you get a service that looks like it will hang together. So it's not necessarily the ones that are weighted most heavily at the end of the day, but by weighting them, you understand what the kind of key drivers are, motivations for the different players. So yeah, that's kind of how we played it. Is there anything I missed out on that? I feel like it's my space, so I kind of took over. Sorry.
No, I think that's a fair reflection. I think for me, I remember thinking that the word used was empathy. I think it helps just to understand that actually everyone who was trying to use the service was struggling with an element of it, and actually the element they were struggling with wasn't that dissimilar. So it was that they couldn't understand it. They didn't understand the legal ramifications of something. They didn't know who to go to for help. Is actually the same for both of those what are seen as opposing users. So then it was maybe a moment of understanding of actually no one's particularly enjoying using this or trying to do it incorrectly. It's actually that they can't understand it, I think.
And I think that language thing is really important and something I really want Louisa to talk about, because I think, one of the key problems of this service was that communication issue and about some of the 18th century language.
I was going to say there was some lovely florid language, wasn't there, that Louisa, you had to work your magic on?
Oh, yeah, I will never forget it. Never. And I still use it as an example of how I had to try and explain why it needed to change and how drastic I actually had to be with my reasoning. Oh, yeah. I have to say I don't think this is one of the sad points for me for this project, even though that document was approved by let's say the content owners, the SMEs, the stakeholders, mentioning, no particular names, and it would have made a lot of lives easier. I don't think it ever got put through. And it's a bit of a, not sore spot, but it's sad because it would have made a difference. Sorry, going to cough.
I thought you were going to cry.
No. Yeah, there's a lump rising in my throat. My content. What about my content? Yeah, that piece of content that I worked on, I think we all remember that very well. Like, wow, it really says that? It's really that complicated? This is what people have to deal with? This is what both user groups have to deal with? How can anybody understand what's going on?
On that note, I was, apropos of that, in the Mary Rose Museum last year, and carved on a cannon, if you can believe this, that was recovered from the Mary Rose, was some of the words, obviously I won't say what they are, that were in that document that you're talking about. And that gives you a sense of the archaic language that we were dealing with. And the other thing I remember vividly was going out into Liverpool Street Station with a copy of that and doing some guerrilla research. Actually, I've done something similar last week on my current project that I'm working on. But just showing that document that you've been eloquently referring to passers-by, and they were just completely flummoxed and gobsmacked that anything official will come out from the government. So yes, it was a challenge.
And then you had building on that. I mean, it's like working with the content. So Louisa was really doing an amazing job of trying her best to clarify that and make it easy for people to understand. And then Ben really did a really clever piece of work about trying to help people work their way through the language and help kind of surface the information they would need. I don't know if that's worth talking about here, Ben, because I thought that was an incredible piece of work about how you help people identify the key bits they needed to concentrate on and kind of cut the crap, basically, so they didn't have to learn lots of stuff that was totally irrelevant.
As I think a few people have touched on, it's kind of hard to cast your mind back, like it's almost a lifetime ago, right, for the specifics. But I do recall like a lot of the work that we we're all aware of the various touch points, the sort of evidences and materials that people were exposed to across different channels. And I know that, I recall like a lot of, conscious effort about, sort of just in time information, appreciating that the sort of the language is a fantastic example of this, but how intimidating all this whole process is, and how how stressful it can be. So, surfacing, just in time information across the digital touch points, at least that we were looking at. I think I recall working part of this guerrilla research as well. I think maybe in the same session. I was definitely, Mike at Liverpool Street still, but looking at different, how the same information could be, produced in like an SMS, for example, an email, as well as paper, and how the different delivery mechanisms could, whether things landed, whether people had, there was enough sort of trust in the source of the information. But yeah, I recall, obviously looking at the mechanisms of how we expose and the time at which we expose this, the improved language, let's say, to users.
And you mentioned there, Ben, delivery. I mean, Laura, from your point of view as the delivery manager, I'm interested to know kind of how did you liaise with the stakeholders, and how was that in terms of communication with what we were learning and
I'm not going to say it wasn't challenging, because it definitely was. But I think the biggest challenge was getting the government policy people, if you want to call them that, to see it differently. I think the way the organisation is set up has actually determined how the service was put together originally, rather than by the user and who the users are and what they need. It was done by structures within the organisation from however long ago that just don't work anymore, or don't work very well anymore, I should say. And I think, once those people, the kind of champions we had in our team who were policy people, started to see actually the way we're doing this doesn't really make any sense, that's when it became a lot easier. But it took a while to get there, being set up in teams that were based around that organisational structure. And actually, I think we had a kind of some champions, I guess you want to put it that way, on our team who really wanted to understand more about understanding user need. And once they got that and understood, that there were other services that impacted this service within their own organisation, and that there were potential issues in how those two services were working together. Once they got that, I think they were really keen to make sure that changed. So I think that was really a really interesting turning point. I think there was some resistance to it initially, just because it's always been that way. And then there's people coming in saying, have you thought of doing it completely differently? But actually, I found working with the stakeholders challenging at different points. But I think once we had those policy champions, that's made the massive difference. Kind of felt supported. And if we raised a question, it wasn't going to be kind of seen badly. It was seen as actually trying to improve the service.
That's really interesting. And in terms of legacy, because obviously all of us have moved on now. I'd be interested to know, I don't know if anyone does know, to what extent some of those experiences that the stakeholders went through, they've carried on, sort of they've changed the way they work longer term as a result. I don't know if anyone knows that.
One can but hope.
Yeah. I think they probably have. Whether the rest of the organisation has, I don't know. I guess there's always a battle, isn't there, between, a battle's probably the wrong word, but when an organisation is structured, even with where the buildings are located, right, for the people who are processing stuff manually, it's very difficult to change the whole thing. You're just looking at the whole thing as a whole service and a whole organizational restructure. That's difficult. So they might change the way they think about things or how they approach a problem, but whether the organization's ready to take that on, I guess, is a different question.
I think what's really interesting is the fact that pattern is been pretty much repeated everywhere I've been. I'd like to know whether anyone on this call has actually been somewhere where they've had a different pattern, because actually the organisation is quite mature digitally and therefore knows what the different roles are and how to work with people and comfortable with transformation. Has anyone worked in where that pattern's not been evident? I'd be intrigued. Are we upping the maturity of government?
It's a really good question. I think it varies very much department by department.
There's only one I can think of off the top of my head, easy, and that's GDS. But you would kind of hope for that, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
Really?
And I think, I think it depends on the history of the department as well, and like what kind of thing they're dealing with. Some of them have, real kind of operational heavy dependencies that are harder to change than a very policy-led department, for example, I think.
And on the subject of GDS that you just mentioned, Louisa, as part of the piece of work we were doing, there were assessments, and we were assessed at kind of each stage. I'm interested, could we just sort of reflect on that and what we had to do, how were we assessed, and what did we have to kind of show, and if we can cast our minds back. I'm thinking in particular of that room, which, in pre-COVID days, we're able to get lots of bits of paper up on the wall, which actually worked really well, I thought.
Are we allowed to mention that obviously we were the first team, as far as I'm aware, to go through what are now the current standards. So at the time they were very much in consideration, but it was another sort of 9 months or so before they actually came into effect. And as I understand it, we were the first team to move from the 18-point standard to the current. Can we say that? Does that give it away? I don't think it does.
I don't know. I mean, was it ever published anyway?
Yeah.
I don't think it was, right? No.
For people who aren't familiar, for listeners who aren't familiar with GDS and the assessment process, could someone just really quickly just give a recap of the service standard and how this is done?
I mean, I could try and put it across in a succinct way, and that the service standard they are ways that GDS will assess services to make sure basically they're fit for purpose and they've done all the things that a department needs to do to make sure it works for the users. And if they're not, I mean, generally, I always think of the term pass and fail, but they changed it to something else because it was considered soul crushing. But if a service was not approved to move on to the next delivery phase, they would have to, GDS would identify which are the service standards that they failed in, I use the word again, and they would have to improve and then come back and go through another assessment. But it's basically to maintain quality in government services. Could have just said that, really, couldn't I?
And it used to be that CDDO would be an external judge, effectively, of how well you'd met those standards. So CDDO, Central Digital and Data Office, they were responsible for administering the service assessments, but recently that's all changed. So now the different departments will be running their own internal assessments. So there is no longer any external measure of whether you've met those assessments. It's very much a localized, which is a shame, I think, honestly. I think it was something that we never looked forward to, but it was always very, very useful and gave you that push. And also, to be honest, working in UX, it gave us a stick because we often knew what was necessary to pass your assessment. and everyone was trying to cut corners. And you could say, well, you can do that if you want to, but you won't pass your assessment. It's up to you. Whereas now, with internal assessments, I get the sense that maybe the strictness isn't there, that it's not as robust perhaps when it was run by CDO. I could be wrong. I haven't been through one yet, but
I think it's probably more open to internal politics, maybe, put it that way.
Yeah, I'd agree. I've been through one, actually.
Have you?
And yes, and I thought it was very strange. And I mean, we passed. The difference for me is that it seemed actually, yes, more political and almost unfavorable. If someone doesn't like your service, or if someone doesn't really believe in it, or two departments have competing interests, goes all the way up to the minister, what they're meant to deliver, it seems like it's very easy for an assessment to be tactical and for the people on the board to be tactically placed. I felt a sense of security with the GDS assessment. I knew that I was going to be held up to a particular standard, and where I failed was actually a good thing, because they were just trying to make sure we done the best job possible. And
casting our minds back though to our specific for the service we're talking about, I mean, my memory is it was an all day pretty much. It was intense. It took us quite a long while to get ready for it. We had most of the team there. We had a bunch of assessors. We were in a room. It was kind of not quite school exam style, but it was pretty intense, wasn't it? And they were asking some pretty probing questions, which is good to the points that you've just been making about.
Oh, we did have a very, very lovely war room there, didn't we? I mean, I think I got a bit arsey wanting to make sure everything was square and at the right level, and everyone's, what are you doing, John?
Aesthetic design.
Definitely came out. But no, I mean, every single artifact we produced was all around the wall, which allowed us to then answer every question by just taking the team over to a part of the wall and take them through our work that we'd done. We didn't have to kind of pretend we did something or try and describe it. It was there. Our artifacts were there. They were being used exactly how we were using them in the session. It was grueling, but the questions were appropriate. The questions were trying to get to the crux of the design decisions we'd made along the way and why we'd made them. And that's kind of what you expect, I guess. No, I think it's a necessary, almost like a ceremony you have to go through, a rite of passage as part of your UX life, isn't it? It's like, right, you don't look forward to it, but you're always pleased you've been through it, and you've been assessed by your peers, and I don't know how many others have been on those panels themselves and been assessing others. It's a community, and we're trying to ensure that as a community our standards are maintained. I think that's a really positive thing.
And COVID, like with so much else, COVID threw an interesting kind of angle on this, didn't it? So obviously the last couple of years, all these assessments that we're talking about have been done remotely. But when I went through one service assessment a few months back, I was very much kind of, when we were talking about it as a team and planning, I said, look, let's do this face to face. And we got everyone in. We had the client stakeholder, another government ministry, one I'm working with at the moment, into the agency offices. And it was just lovely to be, and to have all the artifacts on the wall, exactly like you're saying, John. It was such a breath of fresh air over kind of Zoom calls and remote slide decks and stuff.
All I was going to say is how much I hated doing it on Zoom. I did a few on Zoom, and basically you just have to send over a deck and then ask people to jump to certain pages, and it's just not pleasant in the same way. And you're having to get people to zoom in and have Miro boards all over the place and get people to move. It's just not a fun experience for me. And I know that CDDO moved towards that as their default going forward, but I much preferred the face-to-face.
Completely.
Yeah. I was just going to say about for me, the standards are really placing users, like, people that need the service at the forefront. And it's something that is often needed. We've all worked in fact, we were talking before about the nature of the organization, the structure of the organization, how it's, how the power of, seeing users, people, that are actually utilizing these, the services that they're struggling, the power of, observation and placing user needs there. So for me, the stand is really just about keeping that at the absolute forefront, having an independent panel that can basically say whether or not the services can move forward was very powerful. I think what we've seen is, as they've moved internally, it's just we've evidently all seen other sort of politics can get in the way and allow things to go through it, even if the attention to the needs of users have maybe slipped or not been present. I think one of the key things really with the standards is that, if certainly in the assessment that we went through, if there's a high degree of scrutiny around how many users, not necessarily how many users, but how well we understood the needs of our users, and we need to demonstrate the volumes of people that we spoke to, the ways in which we've sort of tried to understand the needs of users, the sort of artifacts we've produced to gain insight and to iterate sort of design sort of potential solutions to to some of the problems that we've identified. It's really hard to show like a huge body of work in like a couple of hours. I've been on an assessment where I spent 9 months on a particular phase, and I get 2 hours to speak to a room, but and you've got to try and disseminate all of that information into a nice, and basically in person you're able to, you have a wealth of artifacts around you and have things to hand and talk at a high level and wait for those probing questions and hopefully deal with them. But yeah, I find that the biggest challenge is trying to get like a huge body of work distilled into something. It could be that the assessors are hearing about the service for the first time that day, and they're actually like mentally trying to process what this is even for. And yeah.
I agree. I think as well, I remember, Mike, you played some audio clips of some of the users talking about how trying to use the service had made them feel. And I think that was really powerful, because I think that there's probably people in that room who had worked in that area for a long time who'd never heard that before, or never had the opportunity to. So yeah, I think making the user the heart of it was really important. But I think that I remember the room just being silent afterwards, thinking, okay, do need to do something about this. Then was kind of the message.
So for me, there's one artifact in particular, something that John produced. We had, I forget the size of it, but it was huge. It was like a couple of meters across by like a meter down or so, like a storyboard, really, really, really highlighting, anyone that walked into a room and was interested, we had an artifact to point to. Again, I think that is lost in the way that most of us are working these days. We don't have something we can point to and walk people through. But for me, that was an extremely powerful sort of artifact in the sense that people got it right. We could align understandings, the understanding of, because we had something physical, tangible to point to, and people could really, synchronize with what they were talking about. And I remember at the time, actually, John, when you were putting that together, was it Blender? If I remembered that correctly,
No, it wasn't Blender. It was I can't remember. I've used a few in it. But yeah, it was a 3D package, wasn't it, that allowed me to move characters into certain positions, drop in backdrops. But the key thing there was it was a storyboard that tried to empathize with each of the different users that each of them got their own problems, and they're coming together, and this service had to help them solve those problems. And what I thought it did well was tell that story, show you a vision of how that would work in the future, and also the propositions that underpin that. So you could look at any proposition and to like have a look and say, okay, that's that design hypothesis that we're testing there. And then once that was tested, and I loved it, because basically what was happening was we had a pincer movement. So Ben and Mike were together, working with the users and testing how the hypothesis would work with the users, while at the same time you had myself working with the stakeholders and the particularly the lobbyists and legal, and really working with them and trying to work out how that was going to work. And then we'd come together and they would rebuild the storyboard based on our learnings. And so it's always kind of like a living document of where we saw the vision at the moment. And it was always that coming together from the user's perspective and the stakeholder perspective, and then coming back and say, okay, these are the problems. How are we going to fix this, team? So yeah, it's it's an artifact that I really have placed central into my practice going forward. I mean, that was the first time I'd done it, and I think it was so valuable on that project that I've tried to replicate it wherever I go. But it is quite. It took me about 3 or 4 days really to create the first version of it. So it's quite a slow process. I need to probably get my processes faster. But yeah,
I recall you were working on that like over the weekend. I remember at the time being really skeptical about like the value of having 3D rendered characters to drive something home. But like I can't state how strongly like that to me, as you say, we didn't. I don't think the storyboard was ever shown to users, but certainly lobbyists, stakeholders, policymakers, they were looking at the same thing. And I think I think empathy is really like the key thing. That even though these people are clearly like 3D renders, how it placed basically presented user needs in a very real way to people that are maybe, I don't know, in my opinion, hadn't really considered those in earnest before. The package, like having something that someone could visually see and see the storyboard was so powerful.
Oh, while we're saying nice things about each of us, I actually was really impressed, Ben, by your particular. I've never seen it before. I don't know if it was the first time you'd done it, but you built a prototyping solution that allowed us to see every single iteration that had ever happened before. So, and also we could augment that with the stuff that's coming from Mike's sessions and Louisa's content sessions, so that we could actually say why the design decision was made. So it was a tool that allowed you to go back to any version of the prototype and then sort of like it was almost like a time machine. And you could then sort of like look at the design decisions that were made along the way. It was amazing. And I hope that it's something that's been adopted elsewhere, because I just thought that was incredible.
So it's something that I've used. So I created something that can plug into the government's the GDS prototype kit that can allow it to happen. It's something I've used again and again. Not all the time. I think you have to, because there is no overhead that's involved. But the key thing to mention, the real reason for that is, again, like for instances like assessments where someone says, what's the reason for this? You have something you can instantly say, let me just quickly open up this page. Yeah, this has had X amount of iterations. Here's why. Here's potentially even, I think with ours, Mike, I think we even put audio clips. We had sort of time timestamps from the interview process, and we had them connected to our Google Drive and that sort of thing. You could get like some sound bites and a small body of evidence or something to at least give someone the confidence that this wasn't just plucked out the air. But yeah, the idea was to show, obviously prototypes are obviously more often than not in a multidisciplinary team, like owned by an interaction designer. It's usually that person's like, that's just their sort of body of work. But I think what we tried to do is tie all of our work into a single touch point rather than have it scattered about.
We've talked a lot about various aspects of this. I guess sort of reflecting overall, I'm interested to know what people's key takeaways are. And I guess primarily by that, I mean, what would you have done differently?
I don't say this very often, if ever, but actually I think everybody done such an exceptional job and we worked so well together as a team. I wouldn't touch a thing. I really, really wouldn't. I can't fault any of it within the team.
That's lovely, Louisa. You can come again.
I think that's the big learning, is the fact that maybe we needed to take some of the internal stakeholders with us more, so that actually they saw the value of what we're doing. I think it was probably one of the best projects I've worked on for the people I've worked with, the learning I gathered while doing it, and also the product that we designed. And yet it didn't actually go out because we didn't take the senior stakeholders with us enough for them to see the value. I think there's some common components that weren't ready potentially, but I really feel that maybe that's where I let the side down, by not reaching out regularly enough with some of the kind of senior stakeholders that maybe didn't see the value in some of the solutions that we came up with.
I think that's a bit harsh on yourself, Sean. Yeah. I think for me, seconding what Louisa said, I when I think of a great team, I think of this team. It was a really good team, and when I mean team, I don't just mean the kind of digital people. I mean the policy people we're working with as well were great. And I think that yes, we probably there are some stakeholders we probably could have worked better with. But I think my learning, and I think something I took away from it, is the organisation has to be kind of very ready to take on some of the maybe more difficult comments that come from the users. And if they've never been exposed to it before, it might be quite jarring. I'll put it like that.
It got bogged down, didn't it, politically?
Yeah.
But and again, I keep coming back there. That's where we should have. I think that's where.
I think it was bigger than us, John.
Possibly. A few of us that kind of, were trying to link in with some of the senior stakeholders, and we didn't see them often enough is the problem. And so they didn't see the value of what we're doing. I think you're right in the sense that it wasn't just ours. I think the whole program was struggling politically, not just our particular project. But yeah,
definitely.
I keep thinking about, where I would have tried to influence. And I think that is one of the key roles I like to pick up. Is it a key role of a service designer? I don't know, maybe a product manager, but definitely that influencing piece is critical. And that's the bit that we probably didn't win on.
So to follow on from that point then, John, kind of final question to all of you. What advice would you give to another digital team embarking on a similar project?
For me, it's the very short, simple saying, do what is right, not what is easy. I always believe do what's right, no matter how difficult it is. If it's what's best for the users, if you really believe in what you're doing, build it and they will come.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think understanding those sort of political, if you want to call it that, challenges is useful. It doesn't mean you don't do the right thing. So it doesn't stop you doing the right thing, but I think having an understanding of where you might hit up against things so you can prepare for that or preempt it is a useful thing. I think some of that was the news to some of us, made it harder.
What I believe is the right thing to be doing is to be championing user needs, looking at the external users when you're part of the internal team, the part of the team that can influence, and just keep fighting for those people who don't get a seat at the table.
And for me, I think it's about getting the foundations right in the first place. It's about getting the project set up. So that means getting the senior responsible officers in the room and getting them aligned on what it is they think you're doing. And I think that gives you the cover that you need for all the pieces of work, and then taking them with you and showing them how what you're doing is meeting what they set out as your goal. And if the goal changes along the way, that's perfectly fine. But they're with you on that journey. And I think that's the thing that I think I missed on this piece. And I've learned from that, and I do it every other project. I start off with a kickoff session, and I get all the senior responsible officers in the room, and I say, like, okay, guys, what's the problem you think we're fixing here? What do you think we're trying to solve? What do you think success looks like? What needs to happen? What must happen for you to consider this project a success? And just those three simple questions starts the project off in the right way and helps kind of clarify what everyone thinks is design goals. And the reason you do that is because often you've got multiple stakeholders or senior. You've got probably several senior responsible officers, and they've all got slightly different interpretations of what you're doing. So that you're never going to do something that ticks all those boxes. Where if you can actually get everyone to align right from the beginning, this is what we're trying to do, then you're off to a better start. And I think I wasn't there at the beginning of this project and didn't do it really very well when I got there. So that was my learning that I've taken forward, and every other project now it's a key piece.
That's fantastic. On that very inspiring note, we'll call this a wrap. Folks, it's been absolutely lovely to chat to you all. Thank you so much indeed for taking the time.
Thanks for listening to the Understanding Users podcast, and special thanks to my guests Laura, John, Ben and Louisa. If you enjoyed what you heard, do please like or comment wherever you're listening, and feel free to share this episode more widely. And feel free, of course, to drop me a line via LinkedIn or my website, researchable.uk. Links are in the show notes. Join me again next time when I'll be talking to another experienced UX professional and asking them to share their wisdom, tips and knowledge with me. Until then, stay safe and stay user-centered.